November the 28th, 1953. 2:25 in the morning. A doorman steps outside the Statler Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a smoke, glances up and sees a man falling, arms clawing at the air, twisting, coming down feet first through the dark. The body clips a wooden work partition and slams into the sidewalk on 7th Avenue. The man is barefoot, in his underwear, and still breathing when the doorman reaches him. He can't speak. There's too much blood. His name is Frank Olson. He's a 43-year-old Army biochemist from Frederick, Maryland, with a wife and 3 kids asleep 200 miles away. The official story is going to be short and clean: a nervous breakdown, a suicide, a sad private tragedy nobody outside the family needs to think about. It will take 22 years, a personal apology from the President of the United States, and a check for $750,000, roughly $4 million in today's money, for his family to find out what actually happened on that sidewalk. Frank Olson didn't just crack. 9 days before he went out that window, his own government had dropped LSD into his after-dinner drink without telling him. The men who did it worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and Frank Olson was not an accident. He was a loose end. This is the story of how your government spent 2 decades and untold millions of your tax dollars trying to build a mind control weapon out of a street drug, dosing prisoners, mental patients, sex workers, and its own employees, almost none of whom agreed to anything. It's the story of what they found, what they hid, and why the man in charge burned nearly every record before anyone could stop him. This is where it begins. Before there was a drug, there was a fear, and you can't understand what the CIA did next unless you understand how genuinely terrified America was at the start of the 1950s, because every ugly decision in this story grew straight out of that fear. Picture the country in 1950. World War II is barely over. The Soviet Union just got the atomic bomb a year early, and nobody in Washington saw it coming. China has fallen to communism. In June, war breaks out in Korea, and into that panic drops a new word that lands like a slap: brainwashing. The word is invented in 1950 by an American journalist named Edward Hunter, writing about what he claimed the Chinese communists were doing to the human mind, scrubbing it clean and reprogramming it like a machine. Hunter had connections to US intelligence, and the term spread like a grease fire. Then Korea gave it a face. American GIs captured by the North Koreans, and Chinese started doing things that made no sense back home. Some signed confessions saying the United States was dropping germ weapons on Korean villages, confessions that were false, but delivered on camera in flat, hollow voices. When the war ended, 21 American prisoners of war refused to come home. They chose to stay with their captors. To a frightened public, there was only one explanation that fit. The communists had cracked the code. They had figured out how to reach inside a man's skull and flip him like a switch. Here's what you have to sit with for a second. There was a real event a few years earlier that had already put this nightmare in the minds of American spies. In 1949, in a courtroom in Budapest, a Hungarian cardinal named József Mindszenty stood trial before a communist regime. Mindszenty was a fighter, a man who'd stared down the Nazis and then the Soviets without blinking. But the man in that courtroom wasn't fighting anything. He stood slack. His eyes were glassy and far away. He confessed to crimes he could not possibly have committed, reciting them in a droning monotone, like a man reading a grocery list in his sleep. Western observers watched the footage and felt their skin crawl. Whatever they had done to that cardinal, drugs, hypnosis, exhaustion, something, it had emptied him out and left the shell standing there talking. That image haunted the men who ran American intelligence. If the Soviets could hollow out a cardinal, they could hollow out a captured pilot, a defector, a president. And if the Reds had a truth serum or a mind control switch, then the United States was standing in a gunfight holding a knife. The director of Central Intelligence, a spy master named Alan Dulles, said it out loud in a speech. The Soviets were waging a battle for men's minds, and America was losing it. So the CIA made a decision that would define the next 20 years. They would not just catch up, they would win. They would find the switch first. The problem was, nobody actually knew if the switch existed, and to go looking for it, they were going to need a chemical that could crack a human mind wide open. As it happened, one had just fallen out of a laboratory in Switzerland, completely by accident. In 1938, a chemist named Albert Hofmann was working for the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz in Basel, hunting for a circulation medicine. He synthesized a compound off a fungus that grows on rye, labeled it LSD 25, tested it, found nothing useful, and shelved it. For 5 years it sat in a drawer, forgotten. Then, in April of 1943, Hofmann went back to it on a hunch and accidentally absorbed a trace through his fingertips. What happened to him over the next few hours had, as far as we know, never happened to a human being in recorded history. The world melted. Colors screamed. His sense of self came apart at the seams. A few days later, he deliberately swallowed what he thought was a tiny dose. It was still a monster dose, and rode his bicycle home through Basel, convinced he was losing his mind and possibly dying, the streets warping around him like wet paint. He survived, and he had just introduced the 20th century to the most powerful mind-altering substance ever discovered. A dose smaller than a grain of salt could dismantle a person's reality for 10 hours. To a pharmaceutical company, that was a curiosity. To the CIA, it was the Holy Grail, a truth serum, a weapon, a key to the locked room inside every human head. By 1951, American intelligence had a new panic. What if the Soviets got their hands on all of it first? A report crossed the CIA's desk, suggesting the Swiss had a staggering quantity of LSD available for sale. Enough, in theory, for tens of millions of doses. The number turned out to be wrong, an error blown out of proportion, but the CIA didn't wait to find out. They moved to lock up the world's supply. And when they realized they couldn't fully control a foreign source, they went to an American company, Eli Lilly, the drug giant in Indianapolis, Indiana, and quietly asked them to reverse engineer the formula. In 1954, Lilly cracked it. Now the United States government could brew LSD by the batch, domestically, off the books. Supply was no longer a problem. This didn't come out of nowhere. The CIA had already been feeling its way toward human experiments for years. In 1950 came a program called Project Bluebird, aimed at questions like, can we control a man through interrogation? Can we make him forget? In 1951, it was renamed Project Artichoke and got darker, testing drugs and hypnosis on subjects to see whether a person could be made to act against their own will, even in the language of one chilling internal question, made to carry out an assassination and remember nothing. These were the warm-up acts. On April 13, 1953, Alan Dulles signed off on the real thing. It got a deliberately meaningless code name so that nothing about it would ever make sense on paper. They called it MKUltra. And to run it, Dulles handed the keys to a man almost nobody in America has ever heard of, which is exactly how he would have wanted it. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel covers the hidden histories behind the things that shape the world. Real stories, real numbers, no filler. New video every week. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, whether you're in Texas, New York, or somewhere in between. I always want to know. Okay, back to the man with the keys. His name was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist. A quiet, unassuming guy with a club foot and a stutter who lived on a farm in Virginia, raised goats, danced folk dances, and got up before dawn to milk his herd by hand. He also, for the better part of 2 decades, ran the most systematic program of human experimentation the United States government has ever conducted on its own people. Newspapers would later call him the Black Sorcerer and the Poisoner in Chief. To the handful of people who knew MKUltra existed, he was simply the man in charge, and his power was close to absolute. Here's what made MKUltra so dangerous, and it wasn't the drugs, it was the structure. Dulles set it up so that fewer than a half dozen people at the entire CIA knew the full picture at any one time. Gottlieb was never required to file real reports. He controlled a slice of the CIA's budget that he could spend without normal accounting, money that flowed out through front organizations with respectable names, foundations that existed only to launder agency cash into universities and hospitals, so the researchers cashing the checks often had no idea whose money it was. A scientist at a top American university could take a grant, run an experiment on human beings, publish the results, and never once learn that his paycheck traced back to Langley. That's how it spread, and it spread far. By the time investigators pieced the wreckage together in the 1970s, MKUltra had grown into 149 separate sub-projects. At least 80 institutions took part, including 44 American colleges and universities, a dozen hospitals and clinics, several of the biggest pharmaceutical and chemical companies in the country, and 3 prisons. Roughly 185 non-government researchers were involved, most of them respected names in their fields. This wasn't a rogue basement operation. It was a coast-to-coast research network hiding in plain sight inside the most trusted institutions in American life. The same universities that were educating the country's doctors, and the same hospitals that were treating its sick. And the goals were, frankly, insane. Gottlieb's people weren't just testing LSD. They chased hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and a pharmacy's worth of drugs, all aimed at a set of questions ripped out of a horror movie. Could you erase a memory and write a new one over it? Could you make a person confess anything, believe anything? Could you build, out of an ordinary human being, a programmed courier who'd carry a secret and then forget he'd ever carried it? Or a killer who'd pull the trigger on command and wake up with no memory of why? They never got there. That matters, and we'll come back to it. The human mind turned out to be a far tougher lock than the CIA imagined, and LSD a far blunter tool. But the failure is not the scandal. The scandal is what they were willing to do to human beings while they were failing. Because you cannot test a mind-control drug on a filing cabinet. You need people. And the CIA needed a lot of them. People who could be dosed, watched, broken, and if it came to it, ignored. So they went looking for Americans nobody would come asking about. That's the part of this story that should make the hair on your arms stand up. If you're going to run experiments you know are illegal, you don't run them on people who have lawyers. You run them on people the system has already forgotten. And in 1950s America, the CIA had its pick. Start in Lexington, Kentucky, at a place officially called the Addiction Research Center, a federal facility that was half hospital, half prison, where drug addicts were sent to get clean. The doctor running the research there was named Harris Isbell, and he had a working relationship with Gottlieb's program. The subjects were addicts, and a large share of them were black men, locked up and desperate. Isbell dosed them with LSD to study what it did. In one documented run, a group of men was kept on LSD for 77 straight days. 77 days. Try to hold that in your head. Not one terrifying trip, but 11 weeks of your reality torn open every morning with no way to make it stop. And here is the detail that tells you everything about the moral logic of this program. The men in Lexington were addicts. So how did the researchers get them to keep volunteering? They paid them in the drug of their addiction, cooperate with the experiment, and you'd get your dose of heroin or morphine, clean and free, straight from the people running the study. The United States government used the sickness of addiction as currency to buy the bodies of the men it was supposed to be curing. Let me put one worker inside that building for you. Imagine you're one of those men. It's the late 1950s. You came to Lexington to get off heroin because a judge gave you a choice between here and a cell. A doctor in a white coat tells you there's a study. It's safe, he says. It'll help science. And if you take part, you'll be taken care of. So you say yes, because in a place like this, yes is the only word that ever gets you anything. They give you a small glass of clear liquid. 20 minutes later, the walls start to breathe. The ceiling folds down toward your face. Your own hands don't look like yours anymore, and time stops running in a straight line. You want it to end, and it does not end. It goes on for hours. And tomorrow, they're going to do it again. And the day after that. For weeks. Nobody has told you why. Nobody is going to. And when it's finally over, your reward is the exact poison you walked in here to escape. That was one facility. There were others. At the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, inmates were offered a chance to help science by testing a drug the doctors said might cure schizophrenia. One of the men who signed up was a young bank robber named James Bulger, the man Boston would later know and fear as the mob boss Whitey Bulger. For more than a year, Bulger later wrote, they gave him LSD again and again. He described losing his grip on what was real, waking from nightmares of blood pouring under the cell door, watching his own mind come apart and not knowing if it would ever come back together. He believed until the end of his life that the government had used him as a lab animal. The study he was in was run through a doctor under CIA contract. Bulger was a violent criminal, but he was also an American citizen in the custody of the United States, and no part of custody is supposed to include this. And it wasn't only prisoners and addicts. At Harvard, a psychologist ran a years-long study that put bright young students through deliberately brutal psychological stress. Sessions built to attack and demean everything they believed about themselves, again and again. One of the teenage subjects was a math prodigy named Ted Kaczynski, the man the world would later know as the Unabomber. Whether that particular study ran on MK Ultra money is still argued over, and I won't pretend it's settled, because it isn't. But that's almost the point. This was the water everyone was swimming in. American institutions had quietly decided that certain human beings were raw material. Quick question, and I actually want your answer. How many Americans do you think the CIA dosed with LSD without their consent over the life of this program? Not a nice round guess. Your real gut number. Drop it in the comments. Hold on to it. Because near the end of this video, I'm going to give you the honest answer. And it's not the number you'd expect. It's worse than a big number. It's no number at all. And if you think being a prisoner was the only way to end up a test subject, you haven't heard what the CIA built in San Francisco. Because for that one, all you had to do was be a man who made one bad decision on a Friday night. Somewhere around 1955, at 225 Chestnut Street on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco, a building with a killer view of the bay, the CIA opened an apartment and decorated it like a high-end bordello. Toulouse-Lautrec prints on the walls, photos of can-can dancers, red drapes, the works. It was a safe house, one of several the agency ran in San Francisco, out in Marin County, and back in Greenwich Village in New York. And it had a name that tells you exactly how seriously the men running it took the human cost. Operation Midnight Climax. The man in charge was a former federal narcotics agent named George Hunter White, who worked under a fake name, Morgan Hall. In public, White was a hard-charging drug cop who chased down jazz musicians and railed against vice. In private, he drank martinis by the pitcher and ran one of the strangest operations in the history of the American government. Here's how it worked. White put local sex workers on the CIA payroll. Their job was to go out into the bars of San Francisco, find a man, an ordinary man, a stranger, somebody's husband, somebody's brother, and bring him back to the apartment. Once there, the man would be slipped a dose of LSD in his drink without his knowledge. And then George White would sit on the other side of a one-way mirror, sometimes with a cocktail in his hand, and watch. He watched these men come apart. He watched to see what LSD did when you dosed a person who had absolutely no idea what was happening to him, whether it would loosen his tongue, whether sex plus acid might turn a stranger into a source. Microphones disguised as electrical outlets fed everything to tape. These men never knew. They woke up thinking they'd had too much to drink and a strange, frightening night, and went back to their lives, never learning that the United States government had used them as lab rats and filed away the footage. We don't know how many men were run through those safe houses. We know it went on for the better part of a decade. And we know how George White felt about it, because years later, writing to Sidney Gottlieb, he summed up his career with with a line that should be carved on a wall somewhere as a warning. He wrote that it had all been such fun, and asked where else a red-blooded American boy could lie, kill, cheat, steal, and get away with it, with, in his words, the blessing of the highest authority. That was the man your tax dollars paid. That was the sanction of your government. This was not happening in a foreign dictatorship. It was happening in San Francisco, paid for out of the same treasury that paved your grandparents' roads. So, put the pieces together, because this is the American machine that MK Ultra actually was. Not a single mad scientist, a system. The CIA supplying the money and the drugs, American universities supplying the credibility and the labs, American prisons and hospitals supplying the bodies, American pharmaceutical companies supplying the chemicals, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics supplying the muscle. Every gear of it turning inside the country's most respected institutions, and almost nobody outside a tiny circle with any idea it was running at all. By the early 1960s, though, something happened that the men who ran MK Ultra never advertised. It stopped working. Gottlieb and his people slowly, grudgingly admitted the truth to themselves. LSD was uncontrollable. It didn't reliably do anything. Dose 10 people and you'd get 10 wildly different reactions. One calm, one weeping, one convinced he could fly. You could destroy a mind with it, sure, but you could not steer one. The dream of the programmed assassin, the perfect truth serum, the switch inside the skull. It was a fantasy. The CIA had spent a decade and a fortune chasing a ghost, and so it began to wind down. In 1963, the CIA's own internal watchdog looked at the unwitting testing in those safe houses and flagged it as a serious problem. The operation was shut down within a couple of years. By 1964, MK Ultra was scaled back. By 1967, smaller still. You might think this is the part where the system catches its conscience, where somebody stands up, says we went too far, and America quietly fixes it. That's what it looked like for a moment. The experiments were ending. The worst was over. The worst was not over. Because what I haven't told you yet is what the people running this program were about to do to make sure you never found out any of it. And they'd already had years of practice, starting with the lie they told the family of the man who went out that window. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't the history you were taught in school. Do me one favor, hit subscribe. It's the single biggest thing that helps these deep dives reach more people. Okay, back to it, because this next part is where it stops being history and starts being about you. Let's go back to Frank Olson, because his death is the whole story in miniature. In November 1953, Olson was at a CIA and Army retreat at a lodge on Deep Creek Lake in the mountains of western Maryland. After dinner, Sidney Gottlieb spiked a bottle of Cointreau with LSD and served it to the men around the table. He told them what he'd done only after they'd drunk it. Olson, a serious, thoughtful scientist, did not take it well. In the days that followed, he spiraled, agitated, sleepless, telling his wife he'd made a terrible mistake and wanted to quit his job. The CIA's response to an employee in crisis was not to send him to a psychiatrist. It was to send him to New York, escorted by an agency man, to be looked after by a doctor named Harold Abramson, who was not a psychiatrist at all, but an allergist who did LSD research on contract for the CIA. 9 days after he was dosed, Frank Olson went through a closed window on the 10th floor and died on the sidewalk. The CIA officer sharing his hotel room said Olson jumped. For 22 years, that was the story the family got. A breakdown, a suicide, case closed. They were never told about the LSD. They were never told about Deep Creek Lake. They buried a husband and a father believing he had simply broken. Now hold that lie next to what the men at the top decided to do a decade later, and you'll understand exactly who and what we're dealing with. By the early 1970s, the political ground was shifting under the CIA's feet. Watergate had blown the roof off Washington. Congress was starting to ask hard questions about what the intelligence agencies had been doing in the dark. And Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, could see what was coming. So in January of 1973, before he stepped down, Helms gave an order. Destroy the MKUltra files. All of them. Sidney Gottlieb carried it out. 2 decades of records, the experiments, the subjects, the results, the names of the people they dosed and drugged and broken, fed into the shredders and the incinerators. The chief of the CIA's own records center was so alarmed that he put his objection in writing on February 2nd, 1973. He was overruled. The paper trail of the largest human experimentation program in American history was deliberately turned to ash by the 2 men most responsible for it. Think about what that act really was. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was the CIA reaching back in time and erasing its own victims, making sure that the addict in Lexington, the man in the San Francisco safehouse, the prisoner in Atlanta could never be found, never be counted, never be compensated, never even be named. Gottlieb destroyed the evidence of the crime specifically, so that no one could ever be held to account for it, and it very nearly worked. I want to be straight with you about something here, because it matters, and because a lot of videos about this story aren't. People love to imagine there's a single smoking gun memo somewhere, a piece of paper where some executive coldly wrote down the price of a human life and decided it was cheaper to let people die. In a lot of corporate scandals, that memo actually exists. In this one, I went looking for it, and it isn't there. There is no ledger where the CIA weighed the cost of ruining a man against the cost of doing it right. And honestly, that's worse. Because a cost-benefit memo at least means somebody stopped to consider the human being on the other side of the equation. MKUltra never asked the question at all. The people in those safe houses and prison wards weren't a line item that got weighed and overruled. They simply didn't register as people whose consent was worth getting. That's not a bad calculation. That's the absence of one. The CIA knew the whole thing was illegal too. When the government finally investigated, its own commission would put it in plain language. Giving LSD to people who didn't know they were being tested was clearly against the law, and at least 1 man had died because of it. They knew. They'd known for 20 years, and the plan was simply to burn the proof and walk away whistling. So how did we ever find out? That's the part that changes this from history into something you're still living inside right now. The unraveling started, as these things often do, with a reporter. In December of 1974, the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell in the New York Times. The CIA, in flat violation of its charter, had been spying on American citizens on American soil. The story detonated in Washington. Suddenly, the intelligence agencies, which had operated in near-total darkness for a generation, were dragged into the light. In 1975, the government launched 2 big investigations, one led by a commission under the vice president, and a far more aggressive one in the Senate, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho. The Church Committee started turning over rocks, and the things that crawled out shocked even hardened politicians. Assassination plots, illegal surveillance, and buried in the pile, a reference to a program in which the CIA had given LSD to people who had no idea they were being tested, and a mention that one of them had died back in 1953. That one line changed everything for the Olson family. When they read that an army scientist had been secretly dosed with LSD and had died as a result, they realized the government was talking about Frank. Within days, the family was invited to the White House, where President Gerald Ford personally apologized. The CIA director apologized. Congress passed a special bill authorizing a settlement, and the family received $750,000, roughly $4 million today, in exchange for dropping their claims. 22 years after they buried him, they finally learned that the suicide had started with a spiked glass of after-dinner liqueur. But here's the thing about a program whose records had already been burned. Investigators kept hitting a wall. Gottlieb had destroyed almost everything. Whole chapters of MKUltra were simply gone, unrecoverable, erased on purpose. It looked like the CIA had gotten away with it. Then came the accident that cracked it open. A former State Department officer named John Marks filed a Freedom of Information Act request, the law that lets ordinary citizens pry documents out of the government. And by pure luck, a cache of records had survived the shredders. They survived because someone had filed them in the wrong place. Instead of sitting under projects, where Gottlieb's people would have burned them, roughly 20,000 pages of budget records had been misfiled under fiscal paperwork. The money trail. The one thing bureaucracies can never quite bring themselves to throw away. Those surviving pages became the backbone of the 1977 Senate hearings that finally exposed the whole monstrous thing to the public. And in those hearings, Sidney Gottlieb, the man who ran it all, testified. He was granted immunity. He admitted the broad outlines. And then he went back to his farm, to his goats and his folk dancing, and lived out his years a free man. Nobody went to prison for MKUltra, not one person. The records that might have convicted them had been reduced to ash by the defendants themselves. The victims who might have testified couldn't be identified because the list of their names no longer existed. That's not justice slipping through the cracks. That's justice being deliberately incinerated in advance. Now, you might be tempted to think of all this as a closed chapter, something dark that happened to other people a long time ago that got exposed and ended. I need you to understand why that's wrong and why this reaches all the way into your living room right now. Ask yourself a simple question. How much do you trust your government? In 1964, pollsters found that more than 3 out of 4 Americans, around 77%, said they trusted the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. Today that number sits at roughly 1 in 5, around 20%. That collapse has a lot of fathers, Vietnam, Watergate, and more. But MKUltra is stitched right into it. This is the era, and this is exactly the kind of revelation that taught a generation of Americans a lesson they never unlearned. That the people in charge will experiment on you, lie to your family for 2 decades, and burn the evidence, and that if you're poor enough, addicted enough, locked up enough, or just unlucky enough to walk into the wrong bar, your own government does not necessarily consider your consent worth asking for. Every time you hear an American say, "I don't believe a word out of Washington," you are hearing in part the long echo of a spiked glass of Cointreau at a lake house in Maryland. Sidney Gottlieb ordered the files destroyed in 1973. He knew what was in them. He knew people had been harmed, and he knew at least one man was dead. And he made sure the whole country would spend the next 50 years unable to prove the full truth, while the rest of us paid for it in something you can't get a settlement check for. We paid for it in trust. So where does MKUltra actually live today? You can't buy it at Walmart. There's no MKUltra aisle at Costco. But make no mistake, the CIA's LSD program is sitting in your world right now, in at least 3 places you touch or feel every single week. And the first one is the greatest irony in modern American history. Remember, the CIA had a problem by the early 1960s. LSD wouldn't behave. It wouldn't stay locked in a laboratory, and it wouldn't stay locked in a mind. So the agency, hunting for test subjects, started running LSD studies out of hospitals and universities using paid civilian volunteers. One of those studies ran at the Veterans Administration Hospital in Menlo Park, California, right next to Stanford, at the start of the 1960s. It paid volunteers about $75 a session, roughly $800 in today's money, to take experimental doses of LSD and other psychedelics and write down what they experienced. One of the young men who answered that call was a Stanford graduate student and aspiring novelist named Ken Kesey. Sit with the size of this. The United States government, trying to build a mind control weapon, personally introduced Ken Kesey to LSD. Kesey took what the CIA's program gave him and did the exact opposite of what they intended. He walked out of that hospital, wrote a novel about the crushing of the individual by institutional power. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which became a book you probably read in high school and a film that swept the Oscars. And then he took the acid and ran the other way with it. He gathered a band of friends who called themselves the Merry Pranksters, loaded onto a painted school bus, and started throwing public LSD parties called acid tests, with a struggling house band that would soon rename itself the Grateful Dead. The drug the CIA tried to weaponize against Americans leaked straight out of its own experiments and lit the fuse on the entire 1960s counterculture. The summer of love, in a very real sense, was an unintended side effect of a mind control program. You cannot make this up. That's the first place MKUltra lives, in the culture. The second place is quieter, and it's probably in a drawer in your house or on a screen at your doctor's office. It's the informed consent form. Every time you sign a paper before a medical procedure, every time a clinical trial has to explain the risks and get your signature, every time a hospital has to clear a study with an ethics board before a single patient is enrolled, that entire architecture of patient rights exists because of a national reckoning with medical abuses exactly like this one. The idea that a human being has an absolute right to know what's being done to their body and to say no was not always the law of the land here. It was built, painfully, out of the horror of learning what had been done to people who never got to say no. Frank Olson never signed a form. The men in Lexington never signed a form. The stranger in the San Francisco safehouse never signed a form. The consent you take for granted is, in part, their inheritance to you. And the third place, go back to that question I asked you earlier. Your gut guess on how many Americans the CIA dosed without consent. Here's the honest answer. We do not know. We will never know. Not because the number is too big to count, but because Sidney Gottlieb burned the list. The confirmed, documented deaths tied directly to this program are few. Frank Olson's is the one everyone knows. But the true toll, the full count of people whose minds were cracked open in a prison ward or a rigged apartment or a hospital bed, died with the paperwork in 1973. The most honest number this story can give you is a shrug and a scar. That absence, that permanent, deliberate hole in the record, is itself the answer. They made sure you could never know, and getting away with it was the entire plan. Let me slow down here, because this is the part that actually matters. Strip away the LSD and the spy movie details, and MKUltra is a story about a single question. Who gets to decide what happens to your mind and your body? You or someone in a room you'll never see? For 20 years, the answer your government gave was, not necessarily you. If they decided the stakes were high enough, and in the Cold War, they always decided the stakes were high enough, then your consent, your knowledge, your right to say, no, not me, could simply be skipped. Not by a foreign enemy, by the agency that files its budget under the same flag you pledge allegiance to. That's the gap this whole story exposes. The distance between the America that promises you're free, that your body is your own, that no one can experiment on you without your word, and the America that dosed its own citizens in secret and then made sure you'd never be able to prove it. Here's the strangest twist of all, and it's happening right now. That same drug, LSD, and its chemical cousins are back. Except this time, they're not weapons, they're medicine. As of today, psilocybin, the compound in psychedelic mushrooms, is being administered in licensed therapy centers in Oregon, Colorado, and New Mexico. Ketamine clinics operate in strip malls in all 50 states. MDMA and psilocybin are moving through late-stage FDA trials for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, with approval possibly a year or two away. The very substances the CIA tried to turn into instruments of control are being studied right now as tools of healing. This time, in theory, with paperwork and ethics boards and your signature. The whole point of the modern system is that this time, nobody gets dosed without being asked. That system exists because last time they didn't ask. So let me leave you with a real question, not a hook. A question. How many things running your life right now were decided in a room you never got to see by people who were never going to ask your permission? MKUltra is the extreme version, the one with a code name and a shredder. But the machinery underneath it, powerful people deciding what's good for you, and never once thinking your consent was part of the equation. That machinery didn't die on Sidney Gottlieb's farm. It just got quieter. Sit with that one for a second. I'm not going to answer it for you. And when you're done, I genuinely want to hear from you. Have you ever caught your own government in a lie that changed how you see everything since? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the real history behind the things that run your life, subscribe, because there's a new one every week. Hit the like button. It's the simplest way to tell me you want to keep going deeper. And share this with someone in your life who's sure they already know how the world really works. Because here's the last thing, and then I'll let you go. The next time you sit in a doctor's office and slide a consent form across the desk, and you sign your name, giving permission for something to be done to your own body, stop just for a second and notice that you were asked. That signature is not a formality. It is a hard-won inheritance, paid for by Frank Olson on a Manhattan sidewalk, by nameless men in a Kentucky prison ward, by strangers who walked into the wrong San Francisco apartment and were never told what happened to them. Your government once decided people like them didn't need to be asked. The pen in your hand is the proof that, this time, you were. They never asked. Now you get to. Don't ever hand that pen back.